At 28, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I called my parents, crying, and my dad said, "We can't deal with this right now. Your sister is planning her wedding." I remember sitting there, phone trembling in my hand, the world feeling impossibly heavy, my body shaking not just from fear but from the silence that followed. I went through chemo alone. 2 years later, am I cancer-free last week, my phone rang. It was my dad. He was crying. He needs a caregiver. My answer took exactly 4 words. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with the story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? My name is Lauren Whitaker, and I'm 30 years old. 5 years ago, my life was already a balancing act, juggling late-night shifts at the pediatric ward with bills piling up on my kitchen counter. I had always tried to be the dependable one, the quiet achiever, the daughter who worked twice as hard just to be half as noticed. My parents had never hidden their favoritism. My younger sister, Olivia, always seemed to get the best of everything: college funds, birthday celebrations, vacations that stretched across continents. I got hand-me-down textbooks, quiet congratulations, and lessons in invisibility. I thought if I could just be small enough, patient enough, maybe someday I'd earn their attention, maybe even their love. That illusion shattered the moment I was diagnosed. I remember the fluorescent lights of my tiny apartment in Boston, the sound of the phone ringing, the weight in my chest as my mother's name flashed across the screen. I answered with hope, but it immediately cracked. Her tone was flat, rehearsed, and my father's words hit harder than any chemotherapy session could ever hit my body. "We can't deal with this right now. Your sister is planning her wedding." The line went dead. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with my eyes, the room spinning with disbelief. That night, I called the hospital to schedule my first chemo session and tried not to let the panic steal my breath. I became my own advocate, my own nurse, my own support system. Each treatment, each morning I forced myself to sit up and face the world, became a testament to my resilience. The nights were long, the apartment cold, and the loneliness sharp, but I learned to channel it into focus, into preparation, into quiet determination. I kept journals of every reaction, every dose, every fear, mapping patterns, learning my limits, understanding my body in ways I had never needed to before. I built a support network outside of my family, coworkers who became my confidants, neighbors who became my watchful eyes, and friends who carried me when I could barely carry myself. I learned the language of survival in whispers and in schedules, in the precise measurements of medication and the meticulous tracking of symptoms. I discovered that strength wasn't about yelling, it was about showing up over and over, even when no one was watching, even when no one believed in me. And then, 2 years later, standing in my kitchen with a mug of lukewarm coffee, I answered the call that changed the trajectory of my family forever. My dad's voice was broken, filled with regret, filled with fear. He said the words I had never thought I would hear from him. "I need you." I paused, letting the weight of all the years sink between us, the memories of empty hospital visits, ignored birthdays, and silent dinners threading through the space. And then finally I spoke. For words, deliberate, calm, and unflinching, "Call your favorite daughter." In that moment, I realized the power had shifted entirely, and I wasn't the same girl who had waited in vain for their support. I was Lauren Whitaker, 30 years old, cancer-free, stronger than I had ever imagined, and finally the author of my own narrative. Every moment leading up to this, every treatment, every lonely holiday, every unnoticed accomplishment, had been preparation. Preparation to sit at the table of my life and define the terms. And as I hung up the phone, I allowed myself a slow, deep breath, feeling the quiet satisfaction of justice served not through anger or vengeance, but through unwavering self-respect, resilience, and the unshakable knowledge that I would never again be anyone's afterthought. The morning after the call, I woke up in my small apartment in Boston, sunlight filtering through the blinds, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt the weight of all the unsaid words pressing down on me. The chemotherapy treatments had taken a toll, but not nearly as much as the absence of my parents. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring at the quiet street below, listening to the distant sounds of the city waking up, children laughing on their way to school, delivery trucks rumbling past, the world moving forward without pausing for the moments that had defined me. I remembered the first day I received the diagnosis, how the words had echoed in my mind long after the doctors left the room. Stage 3. Aggressive. Intensive treatment required immediately. No family support. That had been my reality. I had learned quickly that relying on anyone else was a risk I could not afford. I created schedules for my medications, organized my appointments, and mapped out my daily routines with military precision. The apartment, which had once been a place of rest, became a command center, my notebooks and planners my loyal soldiers, my alarm clocks my drill sergeants. Each morning I woke up with the goal of surviving the day, of maintaining control over every small detail that I could, because the rest of the world had proven unreliable. My sister, Olivia, was planning her wedding, blissfully unaware or perhaps indifferent to the storm I was navigating alone. Invitations, floral arrangements, seating charts, and vendor negotiations consumed her parents' attention and resources, leaving me to navigate hospital corridors and infusion rooms on my own. And yet, in that isolation, I discovered an unexpected clarity. I observed patterns in my own health, tracking how my body responded to different treatments, noting the subtle shifts in energy, appetite, and mood. I learned to anticipate side effects and manage them proactively. I documented my progress meticulously and slowly. Each step became less terrifying and more empowering. I connected with other patients, strangers who became my informal support network, exchanging tips and encouragement, sharing the small victories, and acknowledging the setbacks. Their stories reinforced my own determination and reminded me that perseverance was a choice I could make every single day. I remember one evening, sitting on the edge of my bed after a particularly grueling round of chemotherapy, the city lights twinkling through the window, and realizing that the emptiness I had felt so acutely for years was transforming into a quiet strength. I was no longer waiting for validation, no longer hoping for recognition or support that would never come. I was learning to be my own advocate, my own caregiver, my own champion. Time passed in a rhythm dictated by treatments, rest, and work at the hospital. I had taken a part-time job at a local clinic, both to keep my mind engaged and to maintain a sense of normalcy. Each patient I assisted, each task I completed, reinforced my sense of agency, proving to myself that I could contribute meaningfully even when the world seemed intent on ignoring me. Slowly, the shadows of fear began to lift, replaced by a growing confidence that I could endure and even thrive. The 2 years of solitary struggle honed my patience, my resilience, and my ability to act decisively under pressure. And then came the day when I received the final results. Cancer-free. Sitting in the oncologist's office, the sterile walls suddenly feeling lighter, I let myself breathe deeply, savoring the moment that I had fought for with every ounce of my being. The news was followed by a quiet, deliberate sense of anticipation. I knew the world had shifted subtly during my absence, and the balance of power had changed. When my phone rang later that week, it was a voice I had not expected to hear with such vulnerability. My father, his tone breaking, asking for assistance in a way I had never witnessed. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with irony and the echoes of the past. I did not rush to respond. I allowed a pause to stretch, feeling the weight of years of neglect and perseverance. And then I spoke, each syllable deliberate, carrying the calm certainty of someone who had endured and emerged stronger. Call your favorite daughter. The silence on the other end was telling, and I allowed it to linger, a quiet confirmation that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I hung up the phone and looked around my apartment, the sunlight catching the edges of my notebooks and medical charts, and for the first time, I felt complete agency over my own life. Every detail I had meticulously documented, every small victory in isolation, had led me to this moment. I understood that survival was no longer enough. Mastery over my own destiny had become my imperative. That evening, I walked to the nearby park, inhaling the crisp air and observing families enjoying the simple pleasures I had once envied. The sight did not sting as it once would have. Instead, it was a reminder of what I had built for myself, the support network I had cultivated, and the strength I had discovered in solitude. I recognized that the absence of my parents during my most vulnerable moments had forced me to develop skills, resilience, and insight that would have remained dormant otherwise. The hospital rooms, the long nights of monitoring my symptoms, and the careful orchestration of my treatments had transformed me into someone capable of navigating complexity, adversity, and emotional strain with precision and grace. And in that transformation, I found a profound sense of empowerment, the kind that is quiet but unshakable, a confidence that no longer relied on the approval or involvement of others. I had become not only the survivor of my own circumstances, but the architect of my future, fully aware that the choices I made and the preparation I undertook were responsible for the life I now inhabited. After regaining a sense of control over my own life, I began to reflect on the years that had led me to this point, the moments of quiet abandonment that had shaped my resilience. I remembered the early mornings when I would rise before sunrise, preparing breakfast for myself in the stillness of the apartment, coffee brewing while the city was wrapped in fog, the hum of distant traffic, my only companion. Those were the mornings when I learned that perseverance required meticulous planning, that survival depended not on others but on the small, deliberate actions I took for myself. I charted my meals, my hydration, my sleep cycles, and my exercise, each entry in my notebook a testament to my commitment to life, to my body, and to my future. Work became a lifeline, not just for income, but for structure, for purpose, for the reminder that I had skills and value beyond the confines of family validation. At the clinic, I was known for my precision, my empathy, and my attentiveness. I made notes on each patient, noticed the smallest changes in their conditions, and connected patterns that even senior nurses occasionally overlooked. The work was demanding, yet it provided a sense of grounding I had never experienced at home. My colleagues became my mentors and allies, offering encouragement when my confidence wavered, celebrating milestones that my own parents had neglected to notice. Slowly, the network of support I built outside of family gave me a new perspective on what it meant to belong, to be valued, to be recognized for who I truly was. During those 2 years, I cultivated a rhythm, a balance between treatment, work, and rest. I learned to anticipate the fatigue and nausea, to create strategies that minimize their disruption, and to celebrate the small victories, like completing a full day of work or walking 3 miles without exhaustion. Every appointment, every test, every infusion was an opportunity to prove to myself that I could endure, adapt, and thrive. In the evenings, I often sat by the window with a notebook or a book, the city lights reflected on the glass, thinking about how different life might have been if I had been met with care rather than indifference. Yet those reflections were not filled with resentment, but with determination. The absence of parental support had forced me to develop skills I might never have discovered otherwise, to understand my body, my mind, and my limits in ways that few others could comprehend. I had become my own advocate, my own guardian, and in that role, I found a quiet satisfaction that was entirely my own. There were moments of doubt, certainly, when fear of the future crept in, when the side effects seemed unmanageable, when the loneliness felt unbearable, but I learned to sit with those feelings, to acknowledge them without letting them dictate my actions. I discovered that patience was not passive, that resilience was not innate but cultivated, and that control over small aspects of life could translate into mastery over larger ones. As the months passed, I began to take small steps toward independence and empowerment beyond my medical journey. I organized volunteer shifts, joined professional associations, and cultivated friendships that were grounded in mutual respect and support rather than obligation or expectation. Each engagement, each decision, reinforced my agency and reminded me that my value was intrinsic, not dependent on external validation. And then, the day arrived when my oncologist pronounced me cancer-free, a moment that brought tears of relief and quiet triumph. I allowed myself to savor the achievement, to feel the culmination of every choice, every plan, every act of perseverance that had brought me to this point. The news was a milestone, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which I could fully exercise the authority I had developed over my own life, where decisions about care, support, and relationships were guided by discernment and clarity. I reflected on the irony that the very people who had been absent when I needed them most were now in a position of dependence, a reality that I approached with calm consideration rather than impulsive emotion. The balance of power had shifted, and I was no longer the one who required validation or assistance. I had cultivated strength in the spaces they had left empty, and that strength informed every choice I would make moving forward. In this period, I also strengthened my connection to the people who had been consistent in their support, mentors, friends, colleagues, each interaction reinforcing the sense that community and family could be chosen and nurtured outside of traditional bloodlines. Their guidance and encouragement became integral to my ongoing recovery, my sense of self, and my understanding of what it truly meant to be cared for and to care for others. Each day of independence reinforced the lesson that agency and preparation are the true measures of resilience, that the quiet actions taken in solitude are often more powerful than any dramatic display of loyalty or support. And as I walked through the city streets, observing families and neighbors engaging in ordinary life, I no longer felt pangs of envy or longing. Instead, I felt gratitude for the skills, strength, and clarity I had developed, knowing that they were entirely my own and that they would guide me through whatever challenges lay ahead. My past struggles had become the foundation for my present empowerment, the crucible in which my patience, resilience, and strategic thinking had been forged, ensuring that I could face the future not as a victim, but as a strategist fully aware of her own capacity and worth. During the weeks following my final chemotherapy session, I began to notice subtle shifts in how I experienced the world. Simple routines that had once felt tedious now carried a newfound significance. Making my morning coffee, organizing the medications for the day, checking in on the patients I had grown close to at the clinic, all of these acts had transformed into exercises of mastery and mindfulness. I developed a rhythm, a cadence in my life that others might overlook, but for me, it was a declaration of autonomy. I started to revisit the plans I had written during my treatments, the notes I had meticulously kept on side effects, symptoms, and energy levels, and I realized that these documents were more than just records. They were evidence of my endurance and my capacity to manage complexity on my own terms. Grandpa Henry, who had always observed from the sidelines without interference, became a quiet mentor during this period. He would call me occasionally, asking detailed questions about my recovery, subtly guiding me to reflect on my progress without imposing solutions. His presence was steady, unwavering, a reminder that support did not have to be intrusive to be meaningful. I began to appreciate the distinction between those who watched and those who intervened, understanding that his restraint had allowed me to cultivate skills and resilience that might otherwise have remained dormant. I reconnected with friends who had been pillars of support throughout my treatment, sharing with them the milestones that had once seemed unattainable. Each conversation reinforced my sense of self and reminded me that validation could be found outside the traditional family structures that had failed me. At work, I began to take on more responsibilities, observing the patterns in patient care, anticipating needs before they were articulated, and streamlining processes that had previously caused delays. These skills, born from necessity during my time alone in treatment, now flourished in professional environments, providing tangible proof of my competence and value. I also dedicated time to mentoring younger staff, imparting the lessons I had learned about observation, patience, and the importance of documenting progress meticulously. Watching them grasp these concepts and apply them successfully reinforced my belief in the transformative power of self-reliance and preparation. Throughout this period, I maintained a delicate balance between care for myself and care for others, recognizing that empowerment is a dual practice of maintaining one's own boundaries while offering guidance and support where appropriate. I began to understand the nuances of agency, of choosing when to act and when to observe, and the strength inherent in those decisions. Even as my recovery progressed and my physical health stabilized, I continued to cultivate the internal discipline and attention to detail that had been forged in solitude. The routines, the careful monitoring, the strategic planning, all of these became second nature, enabling me to navigate complex situations with a calm and measured approach. And yet, beneath this carefully constructed life, I felt the quiet anticipation of the eventual confrontation with my parents, a reckoning that I had imagined countless times during the long nights of treatment. I allowed myself to observe and prepare, to consider the words, tone, and timing I would employ, not out of spite but as an exercise in exercising the authority I had claimed through years of self-reliance. Every phone call, every letter, every incidental encounter with them became a subtle test of timing and resolve, reinforcing my understanding that patience and strategy often held more power than immediate action. I documented these thoughts, not as a diary for reflection, but as a blueprint for engagement, a way to ensure that when the moment came, I could act with clarity, precision, and emotional intelligence. This period also allowed me to reflect deeply on the dynamics of my family, the patterns of attention and neglect, and the ways in which these experiences had shaped me. I recognized that their actions had created both obstacles and opportunities, forcing me to cultivate skills and insights that would serve me far beyond the immediate challenges of my diagnosis. The realization that I had transformed adversity into mastery was both humbling and empowering, affirming that the choices I made under pressure had forged an individual capable of commanding her own life. And as I looked ahead to the future, I felt a quiet confidence that the skills, resilience, and strategic thinking developed during my most challenging moments would guide me not only through encounters with my parents, but through any situation that demanded patience, foresight, and unwavering self-respect. Each step I had taken, from the solitary nights of planning and observation to the carefully constructed routines of daily living, had built a foundation that was unshakable, preparing me for the next phase of my life with clarity, control, and the assurance that I would act not from reaction but from deliberate intention. The day of the family event arrived with a chill in the air that seemed to match the unease in my chest. I had spent the morning reviewing my plans, visualizing each interaction, each possible scenario, preparing my responses with precision. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic outside, and I allowed a moment to sit in stillness, feeling the calm before stepping into a world that had long held little regard for me. As I walked to the car, the city streets blurred past, but my mind was sharp, cataloging every detail of my outfit, the route I would take, the timing of each arrival. I was determined not to be caught off guard, not to allow emotion to override strategy. The venue itself was grand, filled with familiar faces who had attended countless family gatherings over the years. Crystal chandeliers reflected the soft light onto polished wood floors, and the sound of quiet chatter and laughter created a rhythm that I observed without participating immediately. I took a deep breath, feeling the steady beat of my own heart, and reminded myself that I was no longer the girl who had waited for attention or support. I was present on my own terms, fully aware of my capacity to navigate the space with poise and clarity. My sister entered the room, radiant and smiling, completely unaware of the preparation and thought that had gone into my arrival. I acknowledged her presence with a calm nod, letting the silence carry the weight of recognition without the need for verbal acknowledgement. My parents were engaged in conversation near the head table, the posture and expressions they assumed carrying the familiar authority I had learned to observe critically. I allowed a moment to scan their gestures, their patterns, the subtle cues that revealed concern, anticipation, and the slight tension beneath their controlled demeanor. I reminded myself that this was the moment I had been preparing for, that each decision I had made over the past 2 years had led me to this point. And then, as the timing aligned with the crescendo of activity in the room, I approached them deliberately, measuring my steps, allowing the space between us to stretch and heighten the anticipation. My father looked up, his expression shifting as our eyes met, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. My mother turned slightly, curiosity evident in the subtle tilt of her head. I took a slow breath, letting the pause elongate the moment, allowing them to register my presence fully before speaking. I presented the evidence I had prepared over months, carefully organized documents that reflected the independence, competence, and resilience I had cultivated while navigating my illness and recovery alone. Each item was deliberate, chosen to convey clarity, capability, and measured authority. As I laid the documents before them, I watched the micro-expressions, the rapid calculations in their eyes as they processed the reality of my achievements and self-reliance. The room grew quiet, the chatter fading into background noise, leaving only the subtle hum of awareness and realization. I observed without speaking, allowing the weight of preparation and accomplishment to fill the space. My sister shifted uneasily, recognizing the shift in power, the quiet authority I now held. My parents exchanged glances, the realization of their prior neglect and the consequences of their choices apparent in the tension that briefly overtook their composed demeanor. I did not offer explanation. I did not plead or argue. The documentation, the careful presentation, and the measured confidence I exhibited were sufficient to communicate my position and the transformation that had occurred during the time they had been absent. The silence was intentional, a deliberate space that allowed them to fully grasp the distance between the past and the present, between expectation and reality. And as I stepped back, maintaining eye contact but without a single word of provocation, I could see the recognition dawning in their expressions, the unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamics had shifted irrevocably. In that moment, the culmination of years of self-reliance, planning, and emotional mastery crystallized into an unassailable presence, demonstrating that preparation and perseverance had achieved what confrontation alone never could. I took a final, steadying breath, allowing the calm rhythm of my heartbeat to align with the quiet triumph that settled in the room, knowing that this public reckoning, orchestrated through deliberate action rather than emotion, marked a turning point that would be remembered by all present. After the quiet reckoning in the main hall, I withdrew to a side room, taking deliberate steps that were measured, almost ceremonial, as if each one was a declaration of my presence and control. The documents I had laid out earlier were now back in my hands, neatly stacked, a tangible record of the preparation and diligence that had led me to this moment. I allowed myself a pause, letting the silence hang thick in the air, observing the subtle shifts in the room, the way my family's demeanor had changed, the way uncertainty flickered behind their eyes. I opened the folder and began to review the contents methodically. Medical records, schedules, notes I had kept during treatment, and journals that reflected the full scope of my recovery journey. Each piece of evidence was precise, documented in exact dates and times, annotated with observations that highlighted not only my endurance, but also the strategic thinking I had employed to navigate each challenge. The rhythm of my movements was deliberate, punctuated by quiet pauses where I simply let the weight of what I had accomplished sink in, allowing the room to register my competence without the need for explanation or justification. Outside, the faint hum of traffic and the occasional chatter from the main hall reminded me of the contrast between ordinary life and the extraordinary path I had carved through resilience and preparation. I reflected on how each detail, no matter how small, had contributed to this precise moment of alignment, the orchestration of circumstance, observation, and action culminating in a situation where my authority and self-reliance were undeniable. I traced my fingers over the notes where I had calculated medication dosages, tracked symptom patterns, and cross-referenced recovery milestones with work obligations, each annotation a testament to the careful attention and discipline that had become second nature to me. The act of handling these materials, methodically reviewing and reaffirming each entry, reinforced a sense of mastery that had been developed over countless nights of solitary focus and deliberate effort. I paused again, looking at the clock on the wall, noting the exact time, appreciating the precision with which every element of my life was now under my direction. The atmosphere in the room was dense with anticipation and reflection, a space where the quiet power of preparation spoke louder than words ever could. I imagined the reactions in the hall outside, the subtle tension, the curiosity and recognition forming as my presence and actions were fully registered. Each measured movement, each deliberate step in organizing the information, was designed to communicate clarity, competence, and authority without the need for confrontation or aggression. The precision of my preparation, The thoroughness of my documentation and the unflinching calm with which I approached the situation created a palpable shift in the dynamic, one that was quietly yet unmistakably acknowledged by those who had underestimated me for so long. I allowed a slow, deliberate exhale, feeling the alignment of mind, body, and circumstance, and recognized that the tools I had cultivated during my solitary struggle, observation, strategy, resilience, and meticulous attention to detail, had now become instruments of undeniable authority. The folders, the notes, the carefully curated evidence of my journey were not just artifacts. They were extensions of the preparation and foresight that had allowed me to navigate the most challenging period of my life with control and clarity. As I closed the folder, I felt a sense of completion, the rhythmic cadence of deliberate action reinforcing the quiet dominance I now held in the room, a culmination of years of careful observation, meticulous planning, and unwavering perseverance. Each moment had been orchestrated not with haste or emotional impulse, but with intention, a deliberate cultivation of power, presence, and undeniable competence that would resonate long after the room had emptied and the echoes of the past had settled into memory. I took a final moment to observe the space, noting the subtle changes in light and shadow, the reflections that danced across polished surfaces, the quiet testimony of my actions, and felt a steady confidence settle over me, the knowledge that every step I had taken, every detail I had meticulously managed, had built a foundation that could not be shaken and had prepared me for whatever would come next. As I left the side room, the weight of my decision pressed gently but insistently against my consciousness. Each step toward the main hall felt deliberate, measured, carrying the accumulated authority of months spent mastering solitude, strategy, and self-reliance. I paused in the doorway, allowing my gaze to sweep over the room, noting the placement of family members, the subtle shifts in posture, the barely perceptible tension that had begun to ripple through the air since my initial presentation of the documents. My sister, Olivia, stood near the center of the room, unaware of the gravity of the moment, her laughter subdued as she instinctively sensed the altered dynamics around her. I allowed a pause to stretch, feeling the silence fill with anticipation, the slow cadence of breaths, and the quiet click of heels against polished floors emphasizing the rhythm of the unfolding scene. I positioned myself strategically, the folders from the side room clutched in my hands, not as a threat, but as tangible proof of the precision and dedication I had cultivated over the past 2 years. My mind was alive with the echoes of my treatments, the nights of meticulous documentation, the careful tracking of every symptom, every side effect, every victory and setback, all converging into the clarity of the present. I approached the table where my parents had gathered, timing each step with an awareness that seemed almost cinematic, the pauses between movements creating a rhythm that amplified the quiet tension. Their eyes met mine, and I allowed a fraction of a second to linger, letting the weight of my presence and the evidence of my journey register fully before I spoke. I began to outline, calmly and deliberately, the timeline of my treatments, the independence I had maintained, and the meticulous planning that had allowed me not only to survive but to thrive. Each statement was measured, each pause intentional, creating space for reflection, anticipation, and acknowledgement without the need for dramatics or heightened emotion. I observed the micro-expressions on their faces, a subtle narrowing of eyes, a quick intake of breath, the momentary shift in posture as they absorbed the magnitude of the information before them. I allowed silence to punctuate the exposition, understanding that the absence of words can often communicate more than any declaration ever could. The room seemed to hold its breath, the rhythm of conversations in the periphery fading as the gravity of the situation settled into the collective consciousness of those present. I reminded myself with each pause that this was not about retribution, but about clarity, about demonstrating the culmination of preparation, resilience, and strategy. Each carefully documented page, each deliberate step in assembling and presenting the information, reinforced my agency and authority, creating a subtle but undeniable shift in the dynamics that had long favored others. I noticed my sister's subtle unease, her awareness of the transformation occurring, and I allowed another pause, letting the quiet tension linger, emphasizing the contrast between her previous centrality and the undeniable competence and authority I now embodied. I moved through the room with awareness, not dominance, observing the ripples of recognition and subtle apprehension, appreciating the power of presence and preparation over overt confrontation. The air was thick with realization, the careful cadence of my actions creating a rhythm that reinforced my point, that agency, preparation, and resilience command respect in ways that words alone cannot achieve. I allowed myself a slow exhale, feeling the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the measures I had taken, the strategic patience I had exercised, and the meticulous care with which I had documented and presented my journey had culminated in a subtle but unmistakable moral victory, one that required no embellishment, no dramatics, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been achieved through steadfast focus and unwavering self-discipline. I paused once more, letting the moment stretch, observing the room as if from a distance, recognizing that the impact of this display of careful, deliberate preparation would resonate long after the immediate reactions, and understanding that the authority I now held was entirely my own, forged through experience, strategy, and the unwavering resolve cultivated during the most challenging chapters of my life. After solidifying my presence and allowing the quiet weight of preparation to settle over the room, I began to turn my attention toward those who had stood by me throughout this journey, the allies whose support had been constant, unassuming, and quietly transformative. I moved deliberately toward the corner where a small group of colleagues, mentors, and friends had gathered, their eyes lighting up as they recognized the purpose in my steps. Each movement was deliberate, calculated to bridge the space between observation and engagement, to signal that this was the moment where collaboration and acknowledgement of mutual support became tangible. I allowed a measured pause, giving each person the opportunity to absorb the presence and the significance of the gathering, letting silence punctuate the unspoken understanding that we had all contributed to a shared journey of endurance, learning, and quiet triumph. I began to outline the roles they had played in my recovery, not with overt praise, but through recognition of the ways their consistent support had allowed me to exercise agency, maintain focus, and develop skills that would have otherwise remained dormant. Each acknowledgement was precise, a nod to the subtle yet profound impact of their presence, their advice, and their encouragement. I noted the contributions of Dr. Patel, whose guidance in medical strategies had enhanced my ability to navigate treatment with confidence and clarity. I highlighted the attentiveness of Jenna Morales, who had observed my routines and offered insights that allowed me to optimize my daily schedule, preserving energy and focus. I reflected on the steady mentorship of Grandpa Henry, whose restraint and observational guidance had created the conditions necessary for me to cultivate self-reliance and strategic thinking. As I spoke, the rhythm of my voice, the pauses between each mention, emphasized the deliberate nature of recognition and the importance of intentional engagement. The room shifted subtly, the energy moving from passive observation to active acknowledgement, a quiet chorus of respect and understanding forming around the network that had supported me. I allowed moments of silence to linger between statements, creating space for reflection and resonance, understanding that the impact of recognition is amplified by the careful orchestration of timing and cadence. I observed their responses, noting the subtle glances, the small gestures of affirmation, the quiet smiles that conveyed understanding without the need for words. Each gesture and expression reinforced the depth of connection that had been nurtured over time and highlighted the power of consistent, meaningful support in shaping resilience, agency, and personal authority. As the minutes passed, I encouraged dialogue, not to elicit flattery, but to create a space where experience, insight, and empathy could converge, reinforcing the shared understanding of challenges overcome and lessons learned. I allowed participants to speak, to share perspectives, to reflect on the journey we had navigated together, and I listened with deliberate attention, nodding and pausing to ensure that the rhythm of the conversation maintained emphasis on reflection, resonance, and recognition. Through this interaction, I reinforced not only my own authority and confidence, but also the collective power and value of the allies who had been steadfast, creating a network of affirmation and empowerment that extended beyond the immediate context and into future endeavors. The engagement was intentional, measured, and punctuated by pauses that allowed the significance of each contribution to be fully appreciated, creating an atmosphere of calm authority and quiet respect that underscored the importance of collaboration, strategic observation, and consistent support. As the session continued, I reflected internally on how this coalition of allies, developed through shared experience, deliberate guidance, and attentive observation, had not only bolstered my capacity to act decisively, but had also provided a foundation for sustainable empowerment, one that was resilient, responsive, and attuned to the nuanced dynamics of relationships, responsibility, and mutual respect. I allowed a moment to absorb the weight and value of these connections, appreciating the deliberate cultivation of trust, the careful alignment of support, and the shared understanding that had been developed over years of observation, preparation, and quiet perseverance. Each interaction, each acknowledgement, each carefully timed pause reinforced the rhythm of authority, the cadence of resilience, and the subtle but undeniable influence of an empowered network acting in concert to validate, support, and amplify the agency of each individual within it. In this way, the deliberate structuring of relationships, the acknowledgement of contribution, and the measured engagement with allies became a cornerstone of not only personal empowerment, but also of the sustained capacity to navigate complex social and familial dynamics with clarity, confidence, and strategic foresight. As the weeks unfolded following the consolidation of my support network, I began to notice the subtle evolution of my own capabilities in ways that had been obscured by illness and isolation. Each morning I rose with a clear sense of purpose, the routines I had painstakingly crafted over months becoming more than mechanical tasks. They were declarations of control, markers of authority over my own life, and exercises in deliberate self-management. I revisited the systems I had built, reviewing charts, schedules, and journals that captured every nuance of my recovery, observing patterns and adjusting approaches with the precision of someone who understood that preparation and foresight were essential to sustain success. At the clinic, I began taking on additional responsibilities, observing patient care, workflow, and procedural protocols with a discerning eye, noting inefficiencies and opportunities for improvement. I developed strategies for anticipating challenges before they arose, using insights cultivated during my solitary treatment to inform decision-making that extended beyond personal survival to organizational contribution. My colleagues recognized the shift, noting my ability to remain composed under pressure, to synthesize complex information quickly, and to respond with calm authority in situations that might otherwise induce hesitation. I found myself mentoring newer staff, guiding them through the same observational and strategic practices that had been instrumental in my own development. In these interactions, I emphasized the importance of attention to detail, proactive problem-solving, and the quiet cultivation of resilience, reinforcing a culture of preparedness and awareness that mirrored my own approach. Each day, I exercised discernment in how I allocated energy and attention, carefully balancing work responsibilities, ongoing health maintenance, and personal development. I learned to read subtle cues, anticipate outcomes, and act decisively when necessary, all while maintaining the composure and clarity that had become my defining characteristics. Outside of work, I reinforced my personal network, staying connected with mentors and allies who had been integral to my recovery and growth. These relationships were nurtured intentionally, with attention to mutual respect, consistent communication, and strategic collaboration, creating a circle of support that further solidified my agency and capacity for leadership. In my personal reflection, I recognized the ways in which my previous struggles had equipped me with tools that others might take years to develop, an advanced understanding of timing, strategy, and the dynamics of observation and action. I documented these insights meticulously, understanding that they were not merely records but instruments for guiding future decisions and maintaining the authority I had carefully cultivated. Each encounter with my family during this period was approached with a balance of patience and intention. I observed, rather than reacted, allowing my presence, preparedness, and calm authority to communicate more effectively than words ever could. I maintained deliberate pauses, allowing them to register the depth of my competence and self-reliance, creating moments of reflection that underscored the shift in dynamics that had occurred over the past 2 years. My sister, Olivia, began to show subtle signs of awareness, recognizing the distance between her prior centrality and the authority I now held, yet I allowed the moment to unfold without interference, letting the natural consequences of preparation, perseverance, and self-mastery assert themselves. I noticed my parents navigating their own responses, the micro-expressions, the brief hesitations, and the unspoken acknowledgement of their prior neglect. I maintained control of my own emotional cadence, understanding that the quiet application of strategy and observation often yields greater impact than confrontation or dramatics. With each calculated interaction, each deliberate step and pause, I reinforced the skills I had developed: resilience, clarity, patience, and strategic thinking, ensuring that my authority and self-reliance were both evident and unassailable. As I moved through these weeks, I felt a profound sense of empowerment, recognizing that the tools I had honed during my time of solitary struggle were now fully integrated into my approach to work, relationships, and family interactions. Each day became an exercise in thoughtful engagement, measured influence, and the deliberate application of insight and preparation, reinforcing the quiet yet undeniable transformation that had taken place. In these moments, I realized that the years of isolation, observation, and careful planning had not only prepared me for confrontation but had allowed me to cultivate a presence that commanded respect, recognition, and authority without the need for aggression, ensuring that my future actions would always be informed, deliberate, and fully aligned with the agency I had fought to establish. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing the notes I had carefully organized over the past months. Each document, each journal entry, and every annotation was a reflection of the deliberate planning and meticulous observation that had carried me through 2 years of solitary endurance. I allowed a slow pause to feel the weight of the achievements encapsulated within those pages, the quiet proof of competence and resilience that contrasted sharply with the indifference I had faced from my family. The phone on the counter vibrated, and I picked it up, noting the unfamiliar number but recognizing immediately the hesitant tone that preceded my father's words. "Lauren," he said, his voice cracking slightly, a vulnerability I had never heard before, "I do not know who else to call. I need your help." I let a measured silence extend between us, feeling the deliberate rhythm of tension, anticipation, and reflection, allowing him to absorb the significance of the shift in our relationship. In that brief pause, I considered the years of preparation, the strategic cultivation of patience and observation, and the resilience that had been forged in solitude and quiet determination. I realized that the power in this interaction did not lie in confrontation, but in the deliberate exercise of agency, in the measured decision of whether and how to respond. I reminded myself that my past experiences had equipped me with clarity, foresight, and precision, allowing me to approach this moment not with impulsive emotion but with intentional action. As I listened to my father outline the circumstances of his need, the details of his current vulnerability, and the absence of immediate alternatives, I traced the familiar patterns of previous interactions, noting the contrast between his prior indifference and the present reliance on my competence. I considered my own boundaries, the balance between compassion, responsibility, and self-respect, and the lessons learned from the years of independent endurance. In the pause before speaking, I allowed the atmosphere to carry the weight of recognition, letting the rhythm of silence underscore the significance of the shift in dynamics, the quiet acknowledgement that the circumstances had changed irrevocably. I reviewed the mental checklist I had rehearsed, maintaining calm, asserting authority, acknowledging the reality of the situation without overextending emotional involvement, and ensuring that my actions reinforced the deliberate cultivation of agency. The city beyond the window moved with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the personal calculus unfolding within my apartment, yet I felt acutely the gravity and precision of the moment, understanding that measured patience and deliberate action would yield the greatest clarity and impact. I recalled the meticulous documentation of my treatments, the detailed notes on recovery, the careful tracking of progress and setbacks, each element reinforcing my capacity to act decisively, to assess risk, and to maintain authority over the situation. The silence between us stretched, punctuated by his occasional hesitations, the pauses reflecting his growing awareness of the gravity of his own dependence. I allowed the weight of years, the accumulation of self-reliance and strategy, to settle into the space between our words, knowing that the impact of measure response often exceeds that of impulsive reaction. Each breath I took, each deliberate pause, reinforced the authority I now held, the recognition that my competence, resilience, and preparation were not only evident, but undeniable. The room felt charged with quiet understanding, a rhythm of observation, anticipation, and measured engagement, highlighting the contrast between the past neglect and the present recognition of value. I finally spoke, each word chosen with precision, measured and deliberate, conveying authority without aggression, compassion without overextension, and clarity without hesitation, asserting both the boundaries and the recognition that had been earned through years of preparation and perseverance. In that exchange, the power dynamic shifted fully, the years of preparation, documentation, and cultivated resilience coalescing into a moment of undeniable agency and strategic accomplishment. I hung up the phone, allowing the pause to extend and resonate, feeling the quiet satisfaction of having acted deliberately, maintaining control over my own time, choices, and emotional response, fully aware that the foundations laid in the past 2 years had created a structure of authority, clarity, and self-determination that would guide every subsequent interaction and decision. The day I had anticipated for so long arrived with an intensity that I felt in every nerve. I stepped into the familiar space where my family had convened, the polished floors reflecting the soft light from the overhead fixtures, and the subtle hum of conversation immediately quieted as my presence registered. I held myself with calm authority, aware of the power in the pause, in the measured breath, in the deliberate pacing of each step toward the center of the room. My father, seated at the head of the table, glanced up, recognition and hesitation crossing his features, while my mother shifted slightly, a mixture of curiosity and unease in her posture. I allowed a long pause, letting the silence stretch, the rhythm of the room dictated by the collective attention now focused on me. I approached with precision, each movement intentional, each gesture controlled, creating a cadence that emphasized observation, authority, and readiness. The documents I carried remained folded in my hands, tangible proof of my careful preparation, the meticulous work that had supported my independence and self-reliance over the past 2 years. I began to speak deliberately, outlining the circumstances of my recovery, the planning and documentation that had ensured my survival, the strategies I had implemented to navigate every obstacle with clarity and foresight. Each word was measured, each pause carefully timed to allow the information to register fully, emphasizing not only my competence, but the thoughtful deliberation behind every action I had taken. I watched the micro-expressions on their faces, noting the subtle shifts, the tightening of a jaw, the brief catching of breath, the flicker of recognition that they now understood the depth of my capability and the consequences of their prior indifference. I continued, calmly articulating the outcomes of my independent efforts, the successful management of medical, professional, and personal responsibilities without reliance on their support, and the cultivation of a strategic mindset that had allowed me to act decisively in every circumstance. The room held a tense, deliberate stillness as my words landed, punctuated by pauses that created a rhythm of reflection, understanding, and realization. I observed my sister, her eyes wide with awareness, the subtle acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted in a manner that was undeniable, yet executed without overt confrontation. My parents exchanged glances, the silence conveying more than any explanation could, a quiet reckoning of the impact of neglect and the realization that competence and authority were now embodied in the person they had previously underestimated. I allowed the pause to extend, feeling the measured tension, the cadence of reflection and recognition, knowing that the weight of deliberate preparation and strategic self-reliance spoke louder than any dramatic expression of emotion. The conversation remained controlled, precise, each interaction deliberate, reinforcing the structure of authority I had cultivated and the agency I exercised with clarity and foresight. Every detail of my presentation, the careful timing, the calculated emphasis, and the observant pauses created a rhythm that guided the experience of the room, ensuring that acknowledgement of my achievements and self-reliance occurred naturally, without embellishment or confrontation. I maintained steady eye contact, controlled my breathing, and allowed the cadence of the moment to communicate the culmination of years of observation, planning, and disciplined action. The subtle shifts in posture, the small movements, the careful acknowledgement of my presence reflected the power of preparation, strategy, and patience, demonstrating that the authority I now held had been earned through deliberate, persistent effort. Each second of measured silence and deliberate communication reinforced the transformation, the shift in dynamic, and the undeniable assertion of agency, establishing a pattern of interaction in which competence, strategy, and preparedness commanded recognition without the need for dramatics or confrontation. As the interaction drew to its natural rhythm, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment, the quiet yet unmistakable satisfaction of having guided the sequence with precision, ensuring that authority and recognition were established through deliberate action, observation, and strategic engagement, marking the full realization of the personal mastery I had cultivated throughout my journey. The moment of resolution unfolded with a calm precision that I had cultivated over the years, the quiet power of preparation and deliberate observation guiding every interaction. I stood in the living room, the light from the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished floor, and allowed a slow breath to center me. My father's request had been made, the vulnerability in his voice unmistakable, yet I maintained a composed stillness, the rhythm of my heartbeat mirroring the deliberate pacing of my thoughts. I allowed a pause, extending it intentionally, letting the weight of years of independence, perseverance, and strategic self-reliance hang in the space between us, emphasizing the shift in dynamics that had occurred. My sister, Olivia, observed quietly, a subtle acknowledgement in her gaze that the balance of influence and recognition had shifted irreversibly. I held the folder in my hands for a moment, feeling the tangible weight of the documentation, the journals, the meticulous records of treatment, recovery, and self-management that had been both my shield and my instrument of authority. The room seemed to hold its breath, the cadence of silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the quiet movements of those present. I reflected internally on the years that had led to this precise point, the challenges navigated alone, the meticulous strategies developed to anticipate obstacles, and the unflinching focus required to maintain autonomy in the face of indifference. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, and I allowed the moment to stretch, the rhythm of stillness communicating more effectively than words ever could. Finally, I spoke, each word deliberate, measured, and precise, for words that carried the weight of every decision, every strategic action, and every instance of perseverance. Call your favorite daughter. The pause that followed was thick with acknowledgement, the subtle realization of authority, competence, and earned agency settling across the room. My father's intake of breath, the brief tightening of his shoulders, and the quiet shift in posture communicated understanding, without the need for elaboration or further argument. I allowed the silence to continue, reinforcing the quiet power that comes from preparation, resilience, and thoughtful engagement. The room, once familiar in its casual rhythms, now bore the marks of a subtle but undeniable transformation in relationships, authority, and recognition. I stepped back, releasing the folder, letting my presence and the deliberate cadence of my actions underscore the culmination of years of strategic self-reliance. I observed the reactions around me, noting the restrained acknowledgement, the quiet respect, and the recognition of competence that had been earned through patience, observation, and careful preparation. In that moment, I understood that justice and authority do not require theatrics. That measured presence, strategic patience, and meticulous planning speak louder than confrontation. I allowed myself a slow, deep breath, feeling the convergence of independence, mastery, and deliberate action, the unshakable sense that the years of careful cultivation had reached their full expression. Every decision, every step, every calculated pause contributed to a finality that was both empowering and affirming, a testament to the quiet but undeniable strength forged in solitude and intentional preparation. I walked to the window and looked out at the city below, the ordinary life moving steadily forward, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The transformation was complete, not through drama or force, but through strategy, perseverance, and the disciplined cultivation of authority. I had become fully the architect of my life, the strategist of my own journey, and in that realization, I found the deep satisfaction of self-respect, clarity, and the quiet triumph of agency fully exercised.